Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to episode 271 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, and technology firm that helps clients manage risk across four key areas: sales and sales channels, including distributors, resellers, and partners, suppliers, customers, and human capital, which includes employees and contractors. You can check out more information at the Red Flag Group at www.redflaggroup.com. In today's episode, we focus on one of these four key risk areas, that being suppliers, and the topic is breaking your supply chain down into manageable pieces for a risk-based approach. I have back with me Jared Connors. Jared is product manager for the Red Flag Group, and he is a supply chain guru and likes to go into the weeds on the supply chain. This is part two of a four-part series of podcasts that we're doing on the supply chain. It coincides with a series of webinars the Red Flag Group is presenting on supply chain risk management. In this part, we talk about how you can actually break down your supply chain into risk levels and then move towards managing that, evaluating and managing that risk through four key steps: identify, collect, evaluate, and remediate. The episode comes in at just over 20 minutes. I think you will find it very interesting. Please stay to the end, and I will give you the information on the upcoming webinar. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I am the Compliance Ambassador for the Red Flag Group, and I am back with Jared Connors, who is a product manager. We are continuing our series of podcasts taking a look at supply chain risk management. Jared, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks for having me, Tom. I appreciate it.
Jared, we're going to have an upcoming webinar where we go into a bit of a deep dive into our second of four webinars on supply chain risk management. This next webinar will be breaking your supply chain down into manageable pieces for a risk management approach. And kind of from the position I sit as a chief compliance officer or even a lawyer in the general counsel's office, this is always one of the most difficult things for someone who is not from the supply chain to get their head around, because the number of companies in the supply chain is so huge. As I think we both know, the Red Flag Group has identified 23 risk areas that we will evaluate for a company, and one of those categories is antitrust and corruption. And the numbers of incidents where information on these categories comes up in the supply chain is frankly just astronomical. And so one of the things I wanted to visit with you about is, how does someone like yourself, a supply chain expert, how can you explain to someone like me sitting in the compliance function or the legal function how to really even get your head around just thinking through breaking your supply chain into manageable pieces, so that if I do have a risk management system, I can put it in place and start to manage these risks?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'll start with a little bit of background of my history with starting out in supply chain and handling product regulations. And when I first started doing this 10 years ago, and I would log into the company I worked for as SAP Solution, and I would see the number of suppliers across the board, I'd go, wow, this is an unmanageable number for this process. But then when I started working with our procurement teams and really learning about the individual suppliers, and I saw the idea of, say, supplier segmentation, a very popular term in supply chain, I learned that we could do the same thing for supply chain risk. And so when you look at companies and they say, well, I have 20,000 suppliers across the board, I would probably walk in and argue that you don't always have 20,000 active suppliers, number one. And number two, your supply chain, your procurement group doesn't treat every supplier the same, and therefore your risk process shouldn't treat every supplier the same. And what I mean by that very simply is, there are some suppliers that you may have listed on your approved vendors list that you actually don't buy from directly, and you buy through distribution, or it's a contract manufacturer's choice to go out and select those suppliers. And those are just very simple examples of situations where, if you're going to conduct outreach to a supplier who's probably never heard of you before, because you're not selling or buying from them directly, and therefore they're just buying or selling things to a distributor, it's going to be pretty hard for you to conduct a risk assessment on them. So your approach needs to be a little different based on the different categories of suppliers and where they can fit.
So with the recognizing that there are a number of risks that one supplier or a group of suppliers could bring to a company, and we identified antitrust and corruption or anti-corruption, but we could add multiple more. How does someone think about breaking this list down, Jared, into if not a manageable form, at least chunks that could be bitten off and digested in a coherent manner?
Well, sure. That's why I think it's so important also is to really, before you go out to do this process, is understand what risks your suppliers can present to you. So when you get into the process, a lot of companies, and I'm guilty of this too in my past, will simply look at supply chain and they'll say, well, for risk, I've got to think environmentally, I've got to think of this country, and therefore every supplier in this country has got to be high risk because we've all heard certain media reports about a particular country and their activities or child labor or whatever the case may be. And the truth is that you really have to look a lot deeper than that, and you have to understand what their business model is. And I think I've probably given this example once before where one of my colleagues in electronics had set up a supplier for audit, and it happened to be nothing more than Design House. So we are doing an environmental assessment on somebody who is a bunch of guys working on AutoCAD so in an office. So what we really need to do is we need to break down the suppliers for the type of business that they might be, the impact to your firm, how you utilize the supplier, and what does your relationship look like? What's the visibility of it? And we've actually got a few evaluation steps that we'll be covering in greater detail during the webinar to help kind of give yourself a questionnaire of to what is my impact from this supplier and how should I be categorizing them as high potential or low potential or no potential.
Jared, let me follow up directly on a point you raised because you used the term design house. And where in the world you were looking at that term, in the anti-corruption world in China, design house is actually a well-known term for a group of Chinese companies that would act as third-party facilitators to engage in bribery and corruption. So understanding the risks, the different risks, is absolutely critical to your risk ranking going forward. Simply even with the difference of the interpretation or the term design house between industries or between geographic regions or between countries. Let me turn to another area that I think certainly many people who sit in my seat in the compliance practitioner seat really don't appreciate, Jared, which is what about the supplier that you have, it's your biggest supplier, or you have your greatest spend with, or is in the top 5? What's the unique risk of having that type of supplier?
Sure. Actually, you can Google right now. Take your favorite, big consumer brands or electronics company or whatever company out there and Google their top suppliers, and I bet you'll find that published list. So clearly one of the biggest risks of those big top spend guys, the visibility of your relationship. Also, business continuity is a big issue with those particular suppliers because oftentimes what happens is when we have a supplier that's big spends, there's either shared IP or a particular IP that they are providing to our company, and we need them to make this piece. And so the point is that the risk is really high with those guys, and there's a reason why companies focus on those suppliers for risk assessment is because of the visibility, the inability to get the widgets from another company perhaps, but certainly the visibility of the relationship is probably the number one. And I can tell you from experience, there is a very big push at the end of the fiscal year about how we're going to publish that list and what we put on it, because it's so important to those of us in those positions in the company that we make sure that just because they're top spends doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship is squeaky clean. So we actually put them typically through an award process to make sure that they are on that squeaky clean list, so we can put them on that big spends list and we can feel good about it as an organization.
So one of the things you touched upon it, but I wanted to go perhaps in a little bit deeper dive to unpack it, Jared, is I've often heard you advocate that you need to make suppliers a part of the solution going forward. Can you explain what you mean by that in the context of your overall risk management program?
Yeah, I think that is, if I could probably just preach one thing, and maybe an auditor, they'll say document, document, document. My thing is communicate, communicate, communicate with suppliers. And the reason why is because I think that 99% of what you're going to learn from the supplier or about the supplier is from the supplier. So, I've often heard people say, well, I've set this supplier up for, a clandestine audit. I'm just going to show up and not talk to them and tell them in advance. And sometimes those things are effective to, catch them with their hand in the cookie jar, so to speak. But in my opinion, involving them in the process is the best way to learn more about their business. Because what happens with a risk management program, what you're trying to do here is you're saying, I have a perception that this particular industry and country has an issue for these specific risks. And what you're doing by going out to that supplier is you're trying to prove that your supplier doesn't fit that stereotype. And who better to tell you what their position on a particular risk is than the supplier themselves? And of course, as much as I say communicate, 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 I'd also say validate, validate, validate. So what we're doing is we're saying let's involve the supplier in the process, get their take on what's going on within their business because they know better than anyone, and then let's go ahead and validate those findings.
I might even say for our political season, you're channeling your inner Ronald Reagan by trust but verify.
There you go. Well, I was born during that era, so.
So let me. You talked about in the two-way relationship. You talked about the supplier side, but let me turn to the company side in that. In the context of making the suppliers the solution, should a company have a relationship manager, a point person, someone who at least has some greater knowledge of the supplier? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's actually really important because you don't want too many cooks in the kitchen. At the same time, however, having sat in a procurement organization for so many years, but being on the sidelines as that CSR person or that environmental, social, and governance, the acronym always seems to change, an ESG person, you don't want to impact that procurement person's day job. You want to make them aware of enough to be dangerous to hold that conversation. But at the same time, what's really effective is if you've got that owner that's been introduced to all of your suppliers as that person who comes in and says, now I'm going to focus, this person is going to focus on these pieces of our relationship here. And so essentially, if you have your scorecard and you break down your supplier scorecard, there's always, most every company is always going to have that socially responsible or environmental and product regulation all grouped into one section of the scorecard. And so I call that, I'm the B part of the scorecard owner, and I'm going to be able to communicate those issues most effectively. But always that one owner, that relationship owner, has always got to be apprised of what's going on to make this an effective process. Because the worst thing you can possibly do is blindside your procurement person if you've got too many requirements going on with that supplier off to the side.
Let me turn to the keys to creating a manageable approach. Do you have a set of keys, maybe 3 or 5 top elements that you would present to somebody like me around creating a manageable approach to supply chain risk and risk rankings?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've been focusing in breaking your supply chain into manageable chunks on the first key element of that. That's the identify piece, where we're trying to understand the risks that are in my supply chain or your supply chain, which suppliers present the biggest potential for risk. But the rest of that pie goes into the collect, evaluate, and mitigate. And very quickly, what I mean by that is that after we've identified which suppliers, which risks are in our supply chain, how to categorize those suppliers, we now have to go out and execute that program. And like I always advocate, collecting information from the supply chain. So we're going out and we're getting information on and from the suppliers to then get to that next level of assessment, which is that evaluation piece to say, do I need to do more from this supplier? Meaning, do I need to go on site? Do I need to focus on one element of an audit versus the other? For example, our design house discussion a few minutes ago. Maybe my friend who had set that guy up for an environmental impact assessment, if he had talked to them before, then maybe he should have then focused on the anti-corruption and bribery piece of that audit and not the environmental. So he sent the wrong auditor for that. So that's a really good example of going through the process of first identify, collect, and then we're going to evaluate that information. We're going to know what does it mean to me that this supplier is lacking a policy for migrant workers' employee rights. What does that mean for if I'm subject to the federal acquisitions regulation for anti-human trafficking? How could that impact me? And then, of course, there's the mitigate piece. And how am I going to mitigate those risks? Am I going to focus on corrective actions for my supplier? Here's my favorite. If you're standing in front of a bunch of procurement people, as a joke, say to them, well, we should just go ahead and get rid of that group of suppliers because they represent too much risk. Well, they'll of course all throw things at you because it's much harder to do than we make fun of, to say that it's easy to get rid of suppliers. It's much harder to get rid of suppliers. We can't just all of a sudden go across the street in most cases. So a lot of those mitigations actually do lead to corrective action or that further investigation, that on-site audit. And now that you've collected all that information and evaluated, now you're able to get the right auditor focusing on the right piece of information.
So it's really bringing the information together, evaluating, and then using that information for your go-forward plan to remediate as necessary. Did I get that right?
Yeah, exactly. So what do I need to do next to make sure that this supplier is not going to have an issue that's going to impact me? And I always go back to my previous life of when we talk about going out and doing policy and procedure reviews with suppliers. I remember one of my first managers said, you know what we're doing here? You know, the main point of what we're doing here is we're educating suppliers on what's important to us as customers. And that's the whole big piece of a risk management program with supply chain, because oftentimes there are either cultural or legal differences depending on where you're sourcing within the world. And sometimes you have to go out in there and say to the supplier, you know, these things are important to me. Why is it important for you not to hold on to passports of migrant workers? Well, because I have defense contracts and I'm selling to the federal government, and that's considered outside of this compliance for the federal acquisitions regulation. So here's why you shouldn't be doing those things. And they say, really? I'm just doing it for safekeeping. And so you have that conversation, and you'll both come to light on certain things that's important for you and cultural differences for them in some cases.
Jared, that's an absolutely critical point for the anti-corruption compliance practitioner. And the reason is there are three prongs to a best practices compliance program. Those prongs are prevent, detect, and remediate. You've talked about extensively the detect prong, but in those last remarks, you moved it to the prevent prong, and you moved it to the prevent prong by talking about the communications with suppliers. Every time you communicate with a supplier, it is an opportunity for you to communicate culture, you communicate values, you to communicate specific, if it's anti-corruption or antitrust techniques, a wide variety of communication items which allow you to really move to prevent. And then because you have done the collection and evaluation, if remediation is necessary, the third prong can be impacted or affected, which is the remediation prong. So kind of translating your 4 points into what a compliance practitioner would think about, you really hit on the one key area for me, which is the prevention through the ongoing communication. So
all right, great. So I've got some approach that's going correct. I appreciate that.
So there are numerous outside factors to every company. If it was just up to me, or I was sitting in the general counsel's or compliance officer's position, I would only be looking at having a siloed look at legal issues, or in the CCO chair, the compliance issues. If you were in the supply chain VP chair, you might be siloed looking into that. But as we both recognize, there are numerous outside pressures to every company. And sometimes those pressures are reputational. Sometimes those pressures are legal. Sometimes those pressures are even the actions of competitors. And what I see with your approach, Jared, is that it allows a company to present to any stakeholder who might need to see what have we done. Those stakeholders could be your internal senior executives. Those stakeholders could be the board of directors. Those stakeholders could be your shareholders. Those stakeholders could be the fourth estate in the form of the press. It could be your customers. But by having the information available, and as I would say, document, to piggyback on your communicate, you would have the ability to respond to outside pressures in a documented way, which could show the steps that you have taken as either the supply chain professional or the compliance professional to identify the particular risk, collect information on them, evaluate those risks, and then mitigate or mediate going forward. So kind of with that, Jared, I was wondering if you might have some thoughts about now that you have done this initial step or initial 4 steps that you've articulated for us, what should a compliance professional think about the veiled future or steps down the road, or can this process be duplicated or repeated? What do you need to do 12 months, 24 months, 36 months down the road?
That's really great, because that's, you can have a program to go out and check on something now and give feedback to a supplier tomorrow, and what are you going to do about it next? And that's so important. That's why I think it's really important to document a program procedure. What's important for me to do, on what frequency, and what do I do next? And essentially what you're trying to do is say, through an annual process, and I believe it should be annual because there are certain regulations that require annual reporting. Practices within a supplier can change. There are turnover in the supply chain, so you need to go back and revisit these things and also keep things fresh in the supplier's ears. But then coming up with a program procedure is really important, because it's not just saying I'm going to collect certain information or send an email to a supplier once a year to remind them about how important these things are. It's how I'm going to follow up. It's how I'm going to document improvement opportunities. And you see that on a lot of companies' websites out there today, where they're saying that they're showing process improvement, or specifically if we think about some of these reputational risks, green goals. Here's my 2020 green goals. Here's what I plan to achieve. And the best companies out there you will see show progress to those goals that have the future date. And you can tell that those companies have program procedures to follow up on that, and not just wait until a target hits them behind the left ear and say, did we achieve it or not?
So Jared, the kind of the final point that I wanted to wrap up this podcast with is the holistic approach that you have advocated and have articulated throughout this podcast. And I want to repeat it because I think it bears certainly emphasis for anyone looking at these issues. And that's identify, collect, evaluate, and then I would say remediate or remedy any program or project deficiencies that you might have come up with. Within the context of those 4 steps, would you advocate, or do you advocate, risk ranking on an ongoing basis so that you can, on a continual basis, identify your highest risk? How does that evolution occur?
Well, Tom, that's really interesting, because we could probably do a whole other podcast and webinar on risk ranking alone. And the reason why I say that is because risk ranking is really important. But what I think where a lot of companies miss is, what data do they use to conduct the risk ranking? So are they using what they're collecting each year, or is there external information that people can use to do that risk ranking? And from my experience, what I see is, having worked in electronics for a long time, a lot of people rely on things like the corruption perception index and say, well, these countries here, I'm going to risk rank countries. Well, what are you doing to risk rank individual suppliers? Because not every supplier is going to fit into that stereotype or that score. So what evaluation process are you using? And here at RFG, that's something that we take very seriously, and we use a lot of our own data, because we're a team of researchers within the Red Flag Group to find incidences throughout the world, throughout the different industries on each one of these risk areas. And that helps us establish better risk rating, not only criteria, but actual data to say that we have evidence of these industries, these countries, and here's what we're basing it off of. So we're all about the facts in that regard.
Well, Jared, this has been a great learning experience for me. Any listeners who may want more information, Jared and I will be having a webinar on this Thursday, August 18th at 8 a.m. Pacific time, 8 a.m. Pacific time, 10 a.m. Central Time, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and indeed 4 p.m. London Time. So I'm going to have registration details at the end of this podcast, but if you want more information, I hope you will join Jared and I. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this podcast. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you again for listening and invite you to attend the webinar, which will be held on Thursday, August 18th at 10 a.m. Central Time on this topic, breaking your supply chain into manageable pieces for a risk management approach. If you'd like more information, you can go to www.redflaggroup.com. That's also the registration site. You will see a button for linking to webinars, and it will take you to the registration. Of course, the registration is free. I hope you will join us. We're really taking a deep dive into managing your supply chain and taking a look at the risks and then how you evaluate those risks and move forward with those risks and the proper management, both for FCPA compliance and a variety of other risks. So I hope you'll check us out, and I look forward to visiting with you again. Thank you very much.